In the wilderness, God shows up. That's the phrase I used several times in yesterday's video, and it's the one I want to circle around to. You see, we very briefly talked about Moses being called by God in the burning bush. But what we didn't discuss was what God was calling Moses for. At the end of chapter 2 of Exodus, we read this statement. During those many days, the days when Moses was in the wilderness, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. See, the wilderness is a physical reality. Moses, as a nomadic shepherd, found himself in the wilderness. He was shaped and honed by hard work. His reality necessitated a different kind of man than he entered into the wilderness as. At the same time, the people of Israel were in many ways experiencing what we might call a wilderness of their own, but in truth, it was actually a wildness. There's the literal wilderness where God shapes you, a true wilderness in which reliance on God is key. And then there is the wildness of the city. In the Old Testament and the Gospels, cities are cast as wild places. Cities are where the wildness of man increases, where their rejection of God's natural order is juxtaposed against what man considers order. In fact, for much of the Old Testament, we see that what man builds, how man orders, and the tools by which they build and order go absolutely against the will of God. The wildness of the city is where man makes for himself, often at the expense of others. The wilderness is where God makes for man. Egypt builds its kingdom on the back of slaves. For Israel, the cities of the Egyptians are not places of order or refuge. They are places of destruction and hurt. And as the Israelites find themselves experiencing the wildness of the city and all of its destruction, God plans to take them into the wilderness to provide for them. And the calling of Moses in the wilderness is a moment at which God has done his great work in Moses' life so that he can use the shaping that has happened in the wilderness to call his people out of the wildness. Because as chapter 2 closes, God knew. I love you, and I pray today that you would be willing to give up the wildness of the ways of man and accept the wilderness God calls you to. It may seem scary because it's unfamiliar, but in the wilderness, we find that the order of man is an illusion, and that the order of God is provision.